I'm sorry, I only have kids that are happy with it, so something else like that.
Or it could just be like, oh, I don't have, you know, I had to be close down.
Yeah. Right.
What do you guys think?
I would do. Yeah.
Where are you looking at Friday night thing? I didn't actually buy a ticket yet. I'm planning to come on Friday night. I heard that it's closed.
Don't worry. We can make her buy a ticket, right?
to have Minister Livni with us tonight at Hillel to share with us her perspective on Israel's changing role in the world, the U.S.-Israel relationship, and the rise of anti-Semitism. Thank you, Minister Livni, for joining us here tonight. We really appreciate it. For making the trip over across the ocean to share with us your experience and your knowledge. We'll start off the night with a presentation from Minister Livni, followed by a moderated conversation with Rabbi Mike. We'll then go into an audience Q&A, so get some questions ready. And then at the conclusion of the event, we'll have a sushi and wine reception open to everyone. Please join us in the foyer just outside this room, so if you didn't get your questions answered, you can find the minister out there. Tonight's program is sponsored by the Elon Heimlich Speaker Series. We would like to give a special thanks to Lenny Gold and his family, who are generously making tonight happen. Please join me in welcoming Lenny Gold and enjoy the evening.
I'm starting to get the hang of this, so hopefully we'll do okay. All right, thank you, and welcome to the third program of the second season of this series endowed by my family in memory of my friend Elon Heimlich, and thanks again to Rachel Hollander, who I can barely see, there you are, okay, and her amazing team of Penn Hillel staff and students for organizing yet another great event tonight. We're especially pleased that tonight's guest, Tzipi Livni, did I pronounce it correctly? Yeah. Okay. Is the first female speaker in our series, the first Israeli elected official, the first lawyer, and the first to have a 24-page Wikipedia bio exclusive of footnotes. Okay? Tzipi Livni has been described quite simply and accurately as the most powerful woman in Israel since Golda Meir. Her resume includes a law degree from Bar-Ilan University, service in the IDF, the Mossad, and for 20 years as an elected member of the Knesset, holding 8 cabinet positions during her career, including foreign minister and justice minister, the most by an Israeli woman, and participation in Israeli-Palestinian peace talks. She has been included in numerous prestigious lists of influential and powerful world leaders, and her awards include being named a Chubb Fellow by Yale University, and the International Women's Forum's International Hall of Fame Award, both in 2009. One of the topics on which Tzipi will focus tonight is anti-Semitism, also a first for our series. I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce and frame that topic. Rabbi Daniel Alder of New York City's Brotherhood Synagogue had this to say about anti-Semitism in a recent Rosh Hashanah sermon, which was primarily directed to the college students in our congregation who were just beginning their school year. Quote, "Anti-Semitism is a virus that survives by mutating. In the Middle Ages, Jews were hated because of their religion. In the 19th and 20th centuries, they were hated because of their race. Today, they are hated because of their nation-state, Israel. Anti-Zionism is the new anti-Semitism." He went on to say, a recent survey of Jewish college students by Brandeis University found that 3/4 of respondents had been exposed to anti-Semitic rhetoric. 1/3 had reported incidents of harassment because they were Jewish. Much of the intimidation on campus is stirred by Israel Apartheid Weeks and the BDS campaign against Israel. These have become what Easter was in the Middle Ages, a time for attacks against Jews. He went on to say the BDS movement and its campus allies are causing untold number of students to keep their heads down where Israel and Judaism are concerned, and to feel ashamed when they have every reason to be proud. He said, "I fear that Jews or other college students will fall for the big lie about Israel, because while they will hear its rhetoric and see its demonstrations, few students will ever visit the BDS website, where one learns that the movement is avowedly part of the Palestinian national struggle against the very existence of the State of Israel. Nor do BDS materials speak about the responsibility of the corrupt Palestinian government in the West Bank or the murderous Hamas regime in Gaza for the failure of the peace process thus far. One hears a great deal from BDS and affiliated groups like the Jewish Voice for Peace about Jewish and Israeli culpability, but nothing about mistakes made on the Palestinian side, oppression committed by it, or the blatant anti-Semitism built into its policies and publications." End quote. Since Rabbi Older delivered his sermon, American lawyers, in an effort to address a problem that has grown exponentially in academia, government, and elsewhere in the past 20 years, have invoked the civil rights of Jewish students in lawsuits from Massachusetts to California against those who would restrict your right and freedom to be openly Jewish and pro-Israel without fear of intimidation, harassment, retribution, or recrimination, and your right to be freed from anti-Semitism in and out of the classroom. It is on the topic of Jewish students' civil rights and the greater concept of indoctrination and incitement in which the violation of these rights occurs that we hope to present at least one program next year. We know that there are Penn students who have been impacted by this issue in high school, if not here at Penn, where there has been relative calm thus far. I can tell you from personal experience that it can be quite traumatic and has a lot to do with why we're here tonight, and that the current environment at Penn should not be taken for granted and can change. If you are interested in this issue, and particularly if you have been impacted by it, we want to hear from you, and we would welcome your participation in the planning of our events next year. It is quite timely then that tonight's guest is no stranger to law and justice or to hatred directed towards Israel, in addition to all of her other world-class credentials and achievements. So it is my great honor to now present to you Tzipi Livni in conversation with Rabbi Mike Urim, Penn Hillel's executive director and Penn's campus rabbi.
Charging programs is it? Let's hope for good. My speech is on the iPad, no battery. Okay, good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to be here tonight. And we're going to try to share with you my vision about the state of Israel, about our values, and I believe that all together we are participating in a way in the same war in different fronts. One is for the existence of the state of Israel, the other is against anti-Semitism that is rising its ugly head in different parts of the world, including in the United States, and also as citizens of the free world fighting for our values that are being now questioned, I believe, also in different parts of the world. So we are going to speak tonight about Israel, about the Middle East, and Israel, it's a very small state, but yet when I say the word Israel, usually the answer is very emotional. For some, Israel is a Jewish democratic state, respected state, startup nation, a state, a country to be proud of. For some, Israel is those that are looking at Israel through the lenses, distorted lenses of the conflict, and for them Israel is the occupier. And I believe that the truth is that Israel is a wonderful state, is a startup nation. It's really America, a Jewish democratic state, but unfortunately, what we have since the day Israel was born is an ongoing conflict, unsolved conflict between Israel and the Arabs that turned into a conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. And I believe that even though the conflict started long before the state of Israel was established, long before I was born, even though this is the situation, I believe that the role of the current leadership of the state of Israel is to solve this conflict for future generations. Now, the story of Israel is also my own personal story in a way. It starts with my parents. They came to Israel with their family in 1925, before the Holocaust, as Zionists, before the state of Israel was established. And both of them were freedom fighters. They served in the Irgun, in the Etzel. My father was the head of operation. My mother was also a fighter. By the way, they met while robbing a British money train. So my father stopped the train, and my mother took the money not to a pocket. And she put it in socks and wrapped it so the appearance was like a pregnant woman, and they took the money to buy weapons for the Irgun. Both of them were arrested in different operations, and both of them escaped from prison in the most heroic way. My father was in charge on the break of Accra prison, something that was really dramatic those days, because this is the fort that even Napoleon couldn't succeed in breaking its walls. And the story of the way my mother broke from prison was even more heroic, because she asked somebody to inject to her body milk, and the appearance was that she is very, very sick. So they took her to a hospital in order to operate her. And when the operators left the room, washed their hands, and so she jumped from the second floor and escaped. Now, for many, I'm this kind of girl that instead of listening to stories about, I don't know, Red Hood or other stories, the stories were about my parents escaping from prison. And I thought that this is a kind of a fairy tale. I couldn't imagine that this is true until I met the guy who injected this milk to her body, and later on I met another friend of hers telling me that one day somebody was knocking at the door, and she opened the door, and my mother was there with hospital robes. So this is the way I grew up with these parents. So they fought for the establishment of a Jewish state, and in November 1947, the United Nations decided that the best way to end an ongoing conflict between Jews and Arabs in this tiny place that we call the land of Israel and they call Palestine is to establish two different states. One is a Jewish state and the other is an Arab state. Those were the days in which nobody referred to the Palestinians as people. They were talking about a conflict between Jews and Arabs. So Jews danced in the street because they were focused about the idea of having a state. But my parents were in a way ambivalent about this idea, because they truly believe in the rights of the Jewish people on the entire land, not only between Jordan River and Mediterranean Sea, but both sides of Jordan River. According to their request, both of them are not alive, but they asked that we will tattoo on their graves, on the stone, the map of Greater Israel, both sides of the Jordan River, because this was also the symbol of the Irgun. So they were happy because the international community recognized the right of the Jewish people for a state of their own. But on the other side, the idea was to divide the land of Israel. But the Jewish leadership those days decided that the best thing to do is to embrace this decision and to establish our own state. And therefore they accepted that this is more important than keeping the entire land. But this was the Jewish leadership decision. The Arabs didn't accept this idea. And therefore the Arabs decided to start a war against the newly born state because they didn't accept the idea of two states for two peoples in 1947, 1948. But my parents decided the same day that the state of Israel was established, another thing more dramatic for me personally happened. Something that without it, I wouldn't have never come here today. The day the state of Israel was established, my parents got married. So basically, they are the first couple who got married in the newly born state of Israel. Well, basically, they are the only couple that got married the same day. How do I know this? It's Pirat HaOmer. Between Passover and Shavuot, according to the Jewish religion and tradition. But you don't know, my grandmother, she convinced, I don't know how, the Rabbi of Tel Aviv, they said they're married. So they got married with Menachem Begin and a few friends. So they are the first couple that got married in the state of Israel. So basically, in the moment in which the rabbi read the ketubah of my parents, Ben-Gurion read the Scroll of Independence of the State of Israel, the Declaration of Independence. And the Declaration of Independence, I believe, it's not only the birth certificate of the State of Israel, this is also the identity card of the State of Israel. It tells us what Israel is. And the newly born state, it's clear that it is the nation state of the Jewish people. It is also clear that it, with equal rights to all its citizens, a state that since the day it was established called and asked to live in peace with its neighbor. This is the identity of the state of Israel. This is the set of values in which the state of Israel was established. And when we are talking now about the state of Israel, we're saying that Israel is a Jewish democratic state. Two words. But I believe that the obvious, that was obvious in 1947 and 48, it's not obvious anymore. And we have this internal debate in Israel and also outside of Israel. There's a huge gap between our understanding of what does it mean and those that are looking at Israel and say, okay, what is this Jewish state? So talking about Israel as a democracy, well, Israel is not the only democracy in the world, thank God. And it is also true that the nature of democracies in different parts of the world is changing. And it is changing, and I believe that this is another thing that us, as liberals, as those believing in democratic values, need also to fight for. But it's clear what does it mean democracy? It's also a set of values, including rights for minorities, human rights. This is part of being a democracy. But what does it mean to be a Jewish state? This is the only Jewish state in the world. So this is something that we have this internal debate also in Israel. And it's clear that a Jewish state doesn't mean a religious state. And therefore the monopoly of the Jewishness of the state shouldn't be in the hands of ultra-Orthodox political parties in Israel. And I do believe that we should really open a new dialogue between Israel and the world Jewry about this. And let's put aside the old dialogue saying, you know, as Israel is coming to the world Jewry saying, okay, we are your self-shelter in case of anti-Semitism, and you should defend us, and that's it. I mean, Israel will be forever a safe shelter for every Jew. But this is not the reason it was established, not the only reason. Let's have this discussion. What does it mean to be a Jewish state? What does it mean to you? What does it mean to us? And as a decision maker in the state of Israel, when I made my decision, I thought not only on Israelis, but also about the world Jewry. What does it mean to them? So I believe, as I said before, that the obvious of 1948 is not obvious anymore. It's more problematic than this. Because when the state of Israel was established, Jews cried with joy. It was really a miracle. And their children were horrified when the state of Israel was under attack. In 6 Days War, in Yom Kippur War. But the grandchildren sometimes feel alienated to the state of Israel. I mean, I met yesterday, I had a meeting in the United Nations, and I met somebody there, and she told me that she has a 14-year-old daughter, and she said to her, you know, you're 14, next year we'll go together to visit Israel. And the answer that she got from her daughter was, Mom, we are Jews, we are not Israelis. Wow. For me, it was a shock to hear this kind of answer coming for a young girl without an understanding that, yes, you're a Jew, you're an American Jew. It's fine. But here in Israel, this is also your home. And if you want to come to Israel and be an Israeli citizen, you can make Aliyah, and you could be an Israeli citizen in the moment in which you land in Ben-Gurion Airport. And it tells nothing about you as an American citizen. It's fine. You can be both. And I believe that we need to bridge also this gap. We need to bridge the gap between what Israel is, between the values of Israel, and between the image of Israel, but we need to do it not just between Israel and the world, but also between Israel and some parts of the world Jews. So being a Jewish state doesn't mean that Israel is a religious state, but it means that Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people, the place in which we as Jews are demonstrating our right for self-determination, recognizing our rights in a state of our own. And this is not only our decision, this is part of international community decision before the State of Israel was established. And it should be accepted. And the next question is whether these two words, Jewish democratic state, can live in harmony, or it is a contradiction. And of course it can live in harmony. Because when we speak about democracy and saying that democracy means also equal rights to minorities, equality is also a Jewish value. I mean, love thy neighbor? Is it in the American Constitution? No. This is part of our heritage, part of our values. And therefore it is clear that, as was written in the Declaration of Independence, that the meaning of Jewish democratic state means the nation state of the Jewish people with equal rights to all its citizens. And we should take these both sides of the same equation. And our responsibility as Israeli leaders is to have these two values living in harmony. There are those that want to make this as a clash between values. And I believe that the word equality should be also a basic law in the state of Israel, because this represents something that goes hand in hand with the idea of Israel as the nation state for the Jewish people. And trust me, I had this conversation when I was foreign minister. Condi Rice was the Secretary of State, and in Britain was David Miliband, foreign minister, and he's from a Jewish family. And I would remember forever the conversation that we had in London, and they asked me, what does it mean, a Jewish state? Does it mean discrimination? What happens to minorities? What happened to Israeli Arabs? And I had this discussion explaining all this, what I just shared with you, because, as I said before, there are those that don't really understand what does it mean. By the way, Condi also wrote it in her book that this was the moment in which she understood that the nation state of the Jewish people is something that it's not racism, it's something that lives together with our own American values as a democracy. Okay, so I was not talking about the School of Independence just to speak about history. I believe that we as leaders should speak about vision and about the future. So let's speak about talking about Israel as a startup nation. So let's use the Waze, the GPS. And I believe that the vision for the state of Israel, our destination should be a Jewish democratic secured state in the ancient land of Israel. Okay, but in order to keep these values living in harmony, we need to have one thing which is needed, and this is a Jewish majority. And therefore, I believe that we should stop in a station. I would call it the peace station. And we need to separate ourselves from the Palestinians. We shouldn't annex the territory, because otherwise we wouldn't keep Israel with a Jewish majority, and without a Jewish majority there is no Jewish state. We need to understand it. And therefore the idea of peace and the idea of two states for two peoples is as an Israeli interest. It's not a favor to the Palestinians, and it's not even a favor to any president of the United States. This is our own interest, and this is the only way to keep our values and to keep our vision. And as I said before, okay, we should stop in the station. But I'm sure that you would ask me, okay, but there is no partner on the other side, they don't want to sign, they never missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity. Fine. But it's not about them, it's not about the Palestinians, it's about us. As I said before, the state of Israel was established even when the Arabs didn't want to accept it. So what? So we need to define for ourselves at first, what do we want? And if there is no partner on the other side, ways, traffic jam. So what are we doing? Waiting, or trying to find other ways to reach the same destination. And one thing is clear, we need to keep the road open. And therefore I believe that the idea of two states for two peoples represent the interests of Israel. Now, after I shared with you that my parents asked to tattoo Greater Israel on their grave, I'm sure that, I'm being asked in Israel, how will you, the daughter of this parent, believe in two states for two people? So I'd like to share with you something that came from my mother. She was really an ideologist. At the age of 80, she worked, in Shomron and Judea, and she believed in Greater Israel. And I started join politics, and I started talking about two states for two peoples, a Palestinian state, and I hope that she doesn't listen, that maybe she's cooking, there's clothes, she doesn't watch TV. And then one day, I do remember where I was when I got the phone call. And she said, listen, Tzipi, I hear you, it breaks my heart, it hurts me. But, she said, we fought to establish a state. I see young people, young Israelis living for America. So we did what we need to do for your generation. You can make your own decision for your children, my grandchildren. And this is basically what I try to do for 20 years in politics. But it is clear that compromises shouldn't come just from the Israeli side. The only way to reach an agreement is by compromising by both sides. So I negotiated twice as the chief negotiator on the Israeli side. And the first conversation with Abu Allah, he was the chief negotiator on the Palestinian side. We had 2 meetings talking about rights. I was talking about the rights of the Jewish people on the entire land, and he was talking about his family. And one meeting, nothing. Next meeting, nothing. And when we decided that we will never reach an agreement if we believe that during this discussion we will decide whose narrative is more right, who is more just. We are not going to give up our narrative, and they are not going to give up theirs. But the whole idea is not about history. It's not about justice. It's about how we can reach an agreement that gives the possibility for both sides to live in a state of their own. 2 states for 2 peoples means that each state gives an answer for different people. Israel for the Jewish people, the Palestinian state for the Palestinians. And this should be end of conflict and end of claim. And this should be based on an understanding that as Israel gave refuge to Jews who came from all over the world after the Holocaust, and from Arab states they needed to live, and from former Soviet Union, and from Ethiopia. The creation of the Palestinian state is the answer for the entire Palestinian people, including those that are living in refugee camps in Lebanon, in Syria, with keys on their necks, hoping that these keys will open doors in Tel Aviv, in Jaffa, in Haifa. No way. This is against the concept of 2-nation state. This is not why I'm not using just the 2-state, 2-nation state, 2 states for 2 peoples, because the whole idea is not just to establish another state in this tiny place, especially not another terror state or failed state. The whole idea is to end the conflict. And therefore I negotiated twice. And unfortunately we didn't reach an agreement. And we have this internal debate in Israel whether this is the right thing to do or wrong. But there is one thing that should be clear. And this is that when we are talking about Israel's security, there is no right or left, and more than that, with all due respect, security is not the monopoly of men or generals. As a decision maker in the Israeli Security Cabinet, as a foreign minister, as an acting prime minister, I could give an answer to Israel's security because we need to look at the situation from a broader perspective, not just military perspective, but something which is broader. And this is what I did in the Israeli Security Cabinet. And I believe, listen, I'm not talking about peace in a naive manner. We are not going to live happily ever after. I'm familiar with the fact that we left Gaza and got Hamas in return. And Hamas is an ideological group that would never accept the right of Israel to exist. And on the other side, we have Abu Mazen and his group, and we have a national conflict with them that we didn't succeed in solving it. But as I said before, let's decide, us, what do we want? And if we have problems on the other side, let's face it. If we have terror, let's fight it. And there is another thing that I would never, never, never accept. Those that are talking about establishing a Palestinian state without accepting the right of Israel to exist, and basically this is the BDS. And secondly, those that are comparing the Israeli soldiers that are fighting terror to the terrorists that are fighting Israeli civilians. I mean, I'm mother of two. Both my sons served in combat units. I know what the values that they grew up upon. And they didn't change their values when they served in the army. And as a justice minister, I can assure you that in every military operation, every target was supervised to see that this is in accordance to the international law. We can like it, we cannot, but this is the way Israel is acting. And this story, and when unfortunately something happened and civilians are being killed, we have inquiries in Israel. You know what happened with Hamas? When they missed the kindergarten, now they have inquiries on this because they are targeting civilians. This is the way they are. And well, you were talking about law. In any legal system, nobody compares somebody who killed somebody by mistake in a car accident or a murderer. Not moral, it's not the same punishment. It's completely different stuff. And therefore, I would not accept this comparison at all. I know that I got some sense that I need to finish this part of this afternoon. I'm open for questions, but I want to say just one thing to conclude in a way. That I'm talking about the future, and I know that some are pessimistic, what would happen, and what would happen with the nature of Israel as democracy, and are we passing the point of no return when it comes to the peace process, and we are all waiting for the United States to put something on the table, and nobody knows what's going to be in it. But I worked quite closely with Arik Sharon, who was the Israeli Prime Minister, and I really admire him. And he used to tell a story about his parents, because he was a farmer, and as a young boy, his father used to take him to the field to work, and you know, it's Israel, it's very hot, and he was a young child. And after a few hours, he said, "Oh, come on, father, we have so much to work, let's go home, it's too hot." And his father said to him, "Don't look forward, look backwards. Look at what we already achieved." So, talking about Israel, look also backwards. 70 years, what a wonderful state we have. Thank you.
So, there we go. You guys can hear me? So first of all, Minister Livni, thank you so much for being here and for your words. And Lenny, thank you so much for making tonight happen. Because of time, I'm just going to ask 2 questions, and then we'll open it up to students to ask for a few more minutes. The first question I want to ask is, you talked and you painted a very vivid picture about what it was like to try to negotiate for peace, and about some of the underlying values and principles that guide your perspective in trying to create a final peace settlement with the Palestinians. And I would be interested to hear your sense of, is this even a possibility anymore? In some of the circles on college campuses, people talk very hopelessly that the 2-state solution is dead already, and are starting to advocate for a 1-state solution. There was a poll recently done that was run out of Tel Aviv University that said that the support among Israeli Jews and among Palestinians for a two-state solution is declining. So it was down to 43% for Jewish Israelis, and that was down from 52% just a year earlier. And I guess given all of the complexity and some of the hopelessness, like, is there even the political will on the ground among Israelis and Palestinians to have a two-state solution?
Well, I believe in leadership. I believe that those leaders that would make the agreement between us and the Palestinians on both sides are the leaders who understand that the political price that they would pay by signing an agreement is less than the price that their people would pay if they would not sign an agreement. And frankly, I negotiated twice. I joined politics for this reason, and I do remember the day when it was March 17, 2014, and we negotiated with the Obama administration, with Secretary Kerry, and we reached a paper that was framework for negotiations. And March 17, Abu Mazen was invited to the White House, and we were waiting to hear his response. And he didn't give an answer. He didn't say no, but he didn't say also yes. And I met him later trying to understand the reason, and I got all the reasons and the excuses. And later on, we had another meeting of the team, and we heard all the excuses, and my advisor, who's now the legal advisor of the Foreign Ministry, wrote, I do remember in my Yellow Pages blog, tragedy. Tragedy. I mean, this misunderstanding and the feeling that we are almost there. And I'm not talking, I didn't think that we can solve the conflict, but it was putting some parameters that would enable us to continue the negotiation. And therefore the problem is that also in Israel, I mean, there are those believing in two states for two people, but they think, or the assessment is that there is no political will on the other side, that we are going to face some problems, that we need to take care of Israel's security and other problems that we need to solve. This is one part of Israeli society, Israeli leaders. The others, I need to share also the reality. There is a group in Israel that for them, they believe in greater Israel. And the meaning is that there is no hope for peace with them as well. On the Palestinian side, you have Hamas that represent a religious ideology that would never, never, never accept the right of Israel to exist. And on the other side, you have Abu Mazen but he didn't give an answer twice. And therefore, what I'm trying to do in Israel is to convince the Israelis what I try to do here. Let's decide what we want. Because without internal decision, we are not focusing on one goal. There are those that are trying to build more isolated settlements in order to prevent us to divide the land. There are those, we need to decide as a nation what is our vision. And then we'll see what happens with the other side. So if we can finish the security fence, embrace the blocks of settlement, not building outside of these blocks, continue to keep Israel's security. This is part of what we can do without paying attention to the situation on the other side. But the problem is that we are going to have election in few weeks. This is not on the agenda at all. This is part of the reason that I quit politics. Talking about peace, it's quite, something that looks like a naive thing, something that would never happen. And I hope that in the next election, well, frankly, you know that I led the opposition in Israel, I do believe that this is the right thing to do. I would never accept the image or the perception of those saying that talking about two states for two peoples represent the Palestinian interest, it represents the Israeli interest. And just imagine what would happen if Abu Mazen would say tomorrow morning, you know what, I give up. Take the PA, the Palestinian Authority. What would we do? Take care of all these millions of Palestinians? to their health, education, welfare. What happened if they would decide that they want to vote for the Knesset? We are going to lose what we kept, what we fought for 70 years now. And we need to make this decision. The unfortunate situation is that it's not on the agenda. And another unfortunate situation is that, well, basically I was the only one that continued speaking about it. And other leaders, believing that this is the right thing to do, are not willing to say so, because they will be criticized as left-wing cooperating with the enemy. All this bullshit, excuse me. But that's it.
So the last question I'll ask before we open it up to students is to shift to North America. And there is a lot of debate and a lot of different ways of framing this. And I think we even heard Lenny say some of it in his introduction. There are certain people in the North American camp that say any criticism of Israel that applies a double standard is inherently anti-Semitic because it's the only Jewish state, and once you apply a double standard, it's inherently anti-Semitic. And then there's also people who say that, no, you can be critical of policies, you can be critical of practices. So I'm interested from your perspective, what is the dividing line between criticism of Israel, boycott of Israel, and the line of when it becomes anti-Semitic?
Okay, I think that there's a huge difference between criticism of any Israeli government policy or not accepting Zionism as a legitimate aspiration and ideology. I was in the opposition. I criticized my own government. It doesn't make me less Zionist than others. And therefore, as long as this is a debate, and when it comes to the Jewish communities or Jewish leadership, it comes with love, with care. It's within the family. So let's have this discussion. It's fine, as long as, and now I'm going to draw the line, as long as it's not against the right of Israel to exist, the right of Israel to defend itself, the right of Israel to exist as a Jewish state, as a nation state of the Jewish people, and the right of Israel to make decisions about our future. So this is the line. So we can have this debate, everyone can criticize any Israel, also the government that I was part of. It's fine, it's okay. It's criticizing policy. It's not undermining the right of the state to exist as a Jewish state.
So there are microphones, there's one microphone here, so if you have a question, come on up and you can ask your question. Yeah, great. And I guess we'll just say, it seems like a pretty balanced crowd tonight, but just try to ask a question, right? And to try to make it like short enough and answerable. And then if you have something that you feel like is more of a statement, to make it short and then let the minister respond to it, as opposed to, if you're feeling the need to pontificate, there's lots of good listeners here. We'll listen to you later on, okay? Great, thank you.
Hi, I'm Mallory. And I've read over the last year or so people writing opinions about having a third or a three-state solution, one in the West Bank, one in Gaza, and one in Israel, with Jerusalem being the capital of Israel. What are your thoughts on this? Does it hold any water? Is it something that just people are talking about on the internet and like that's it?
When Netanyahu had his first press conference with Trump said, well, I want to make the ultimate deal. I truly don't care whether it's one state, two states, it's fine by me. And I said, okay, it's fine by me as well. No, I mean, I want to end this conflict. Everything that really ends the conflict and finish all the national claims and demands from Israel, that's fine. My vision is not about establishing a Palestinian state. It's about keeping Israel as a Jewish democratic state. If they want one state with Gaza Strip and the West Bank, fine by me. If they want Gaza Strip and the West Bank as different states, fine by me. If I can give Gaza back to Egypt, it's better. I mean, the whole idea is that we cannot regarding law go back to 67. We are not going to go back to the lines of 67 because we built settlements when the vision was that we would live all together with equal rights. And most of the Israelis are living in the blocks of settlements that takes only a few percentage of the West Bank. And so the idea, since we cannot just give back Gaza Strip to Egypt and West Bank, or most of the West Bank to Jordan, so we need to create something new. So this creation is very difficult, very problematic. But for me, the most important thing, I need a signature saying that this is the end of conflict, borders, and a Jewish democratic state. And these are the days in which Abu Mazen is in a way giving up Gaza. He stops the money, he doesn't care what's happening there, but, and another thing, of course, is Jewish democratic and secure state of Israel.
My name is Jesse, and I'm very grateful to meet you. And I have a two-part question, one for America and one for Israel. When it comes to America, you have people on the left that are very much pro-Palestinian and BDS because they believe in Palestinian rights and feel that Palestinians are oppressed, and very anti-Zionist and exactly so, along the lines of what Rabbi Mike was asking you. And then also on the right, you have basically modern-day Nazis. And so how do you see in America the American Jews that feel pressured that the Democratic Party has fringes that don't really accept them, and then also on the right, there are fringes that don't really accept or respect them, especially when a lot of the right Republicans are evangelical Christians who just want to convert us to Christianity and bring back, their Jesus. Anyway, that's the American question. The Israeli question is, has there ever been an idea to, and I know this is just crazy, but at this point you might as well try, has there ever been a discussion with Jordan to sort of, open up and cede some of their land to help create the Palestinian state? Because while we have a peace with Jordan, I know Hamas in Egypt, that's a whole nother story, but if you ask the Hashemite kingdom and to allow some of the land so that it's a viable state, not just, oh, it's this bifurcated two small state that can't possibly exist. Was there ever any meaningful dialogue with Jordan to help a sizable Palestinian state exist? With that,
Can we take one more question and then we'll have the minister answer in different segments?
No, I'm not going to text now, I'm just writing the question.
Hi, thanks for coming, first of all. I'm wondering how you think that President Trump has impacted the two-state peace process with the embassy move from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, first of all, and then earlier this week, his tweet about the Golan Heights, how he wants to recognize the Golan Heights as sovereign Israel.
More than a tweet.
Thank you.
Okay, great. So let's take one more, and then we'll give the minister a chance to respond, and then at least the two other people who are waiting in line, you'll get to ask your question also. Good? Okay, ready?
This is quite on my height, I had to adjust it. Mr. Livni, it's a great honor to be able to speak a question directly at you as somebody who has campaigned for you in 2009 when you were head in Kadima, Israel, and Jordan. And my question for you would be, we were talking earlier about the sort of weird symbiotic relationship, not weird, but between the state of Israel and Jews abroad. And as somebody who's experienced it both here and in another country, I wonder if you could comment about the responsibility of Israeli policies and Israeli policy makers towards Jews abroad, and in particular with regards to settlements and settlement making, which I personally feel is the greatest obstacle to advocating for Israel in a foreign space. Thank you again.
Okay. Of course, I said before that as an Israeli decision maker, I believe that my responsibility is not only for Israelis, but also for Israel as a Jewish state, and the meaning also what is the impact of my decision on the world Jewry. But frankly, settlements, your problem with settlements is that make it difficult to advocate for Israel. I'll tell you what are my problems with new settlements activities. My problem is that new settlements make it very difficult to reach an agreement in the end. And this is much more problematic than just, problems in advocating for Israel. And I agree that on everything else, I can explain. I mean, I know that I can have I'm sure that you are being asked to know this, about Israel as a nation state of the Jewish people. I gave an answer here. Equal rights with all nation state with equal rights. The security fence, you're being asked about the security fence? No? Or this is something which is accepted? So a short story about this. I was a member of the Israeli cabinet when we decided to the land in accordance to the idea of two states. I mean, we are not going, as I said, it's not a fairy tale. At first we need to build a border, to build it. And the next week I was invited, the Europeans usually invite some Israelis, some Palestinians, some Europeans to a weekend in Europe, believing that we would end the conflict in this weekend. So I was invited, and the Palestinians were there, and they were talking about Berlin Wall and ghettoization and all this stuff. And I said, hello, Berlin Wall divided one nation into two. If you support the idea of two states, so therefore this is the beginning of dividing the land. And maybe after 50 years we can also demolish this wall. And I convinced also the Americans to support the wall because they said, but it's not on 67-9. I said, okay, so what? This is something that can be adjusted after reaching an agreement. But as long as we don't have the agreement, we are doing something that supports the idea. If we would demolish the wall, the meaning is that we are taking the idea, it was President Bush those days, Bush vision was also two states for two people, it takes it back. Settlements are part of another vision. And I do remember the days after 67. And the idea of Menachem Begin and the idea of settlements was to live in one state. This was the idea. But Menachem Begin also wanted to give the Palestinians Israeli citizenship. Because in a place in which I grew up, according to Jabotinsky vision, it was about equal rights as part of Zionism. So the idea was there were two possibilities, one state with equal rights or two states. This is the choice. And settlements activities are part of the idea of one state. And there's a need to make a difference between the blocks of settlements and isolated settlements, because blocks of settlements, basically vast majority of Israelis that are living outside of the 67-9 are living in blocks of settlement that takes only 50% of the West Bank, and the Arabs and the Palestinians understand that there are going to be adjustment to the 67 line. That's fine. This is part of history. We cannot change it now. But building another settlement, I believe that it's immoral. I believe that it's immoral not for the Palestinians. I believe that it's immoral to send a young family to live on a hill in an isolated place. What for? It's not part of Israel's security. And therefore, I believe that this is not our interest. And I completely agree that this is the only thing that advocating for Israel, I can give answer on all the other things. This is part of another vision. So I can give an answer to the situation on the ground. This is what happened. We had another vision, and we can give an answer to it by drawing the line and the border. I cannot explain new settlements activities outside of the blocks of settlement. No, I have more answers to give. on Jerusalem and Golan, and I mean, I'm an Israeli, and Jerusalem is the capital of the state of Israel. And therefore, embassies of America and others can and should be in the capital of the state of Israel. Jerusalem was the capital of the state of Israel since 1949, long before 1967. It's not connected to this. But what happened is that with Trump, I listened to Trump's speech when he moved the embassy. And it was very accurate. I think that the lawyer drafted it. No, really. It said there that he's moving the embassy, but yet it doesn't jeopardize any final status agreement that would be reached between Israel and the Palestinians that would define also the borders of Jerusalem. Okay, so symbolically it was something important for Israelis. Now, if we had two different leaders in Israel and on the Palestinian side, it could be nothing. I mean, as an Israeli leader, my reaction was, thank you, Mr. President. Now, I do believe in two states, two peoples, and Jerusalem is on the table since Oslo Agreement, and we will negotiate the borders of Israel and the future Palestinian state. But Jerusalem is the capital without any connection to where the exact borders of Jerusalem will be. And it's also clear that we will not go back to the 67 line in Jerusalem. And with this message, I would call Abu Mazen, saying, listen, I'm sure that you are frustrated, but it's just an embassy, and Jerusalem is our capital. Let's continue negotiations. But instead, in Israel, people said, okay, great, we can get whatever we want from the United States. The Palestinians were frustrated, said, okay, we are not negotiating. So it was, as an Israeli, I was quite even emotional and happy. I participated in this ceremony. And talking about Golan Heights, it serves the interest of Israel in days in which it is less sensitive. Because years ago, this kind of declaration can be, Casus Belli with strong Assad or something. This is not the situation these days. So as an Israeli, I welcome this as well. With Jordan, please, any idea about confederation with Jordan, all this stuff, it cannot work, it would not work. And frankly, in Jordan these days, there are more than 50% of Palestinians living there, of the population. And assuming, and it's not about taking land in Jordan to give the Palestinians. So what's the idea? Are you talking about transferring the Palestinians to Jordan? It will never happen. I would not accept it. As a Jew, as an Israeli. This is not something that Israel would do. So in any solution, we need to understand that we need to, any solution, assuming that the Palestinian state say we don't want a state, assuming that the Arabs would say we are willing to make peace with Israel without the Palestinians, what are we going to do with all these Palestinians living here? And therefore, this cannot be part of any, it's not a solution, basically. Now, about extremists, both sides of the aisle, I would say. For many years, the relations between Israel and the United States were bipartisan. It is very important. It's important for Israel's security. It's strategic part of the existence of Israel. And in the last few years, it's becoming a kind of relation between Bibi and Trump, and Netanyahu, Trump, Republican, Likud, and others feel that they are not part of this. And it's a pity. I believe that our responsibility also as Israelis is to work and to have these discussions with both sides. And what I try to explain also is that the choice is not between being pro-Palestinian or pro-Israeli. You can be pro-peace. Not everything is a zero-sum game. And an American president who supports the idea of two-state People is not anti-Israeli and pro-Palestinian. As long as, and this is something that unfortunately I hear some, those that don't understand what's happening. And therefore they are not just criticizing Israeli government policy, but they are not, do not understand what's going on. You know, another story, and then we take other questions. When I was foreign minister, I met leaders coming from all over the world, criticizing Israel. And next question I asked them, listen, do you want Israel to go back to 67 line? They said, yes, great, this is what we believe in, just make the decision. I say, fine. And I took a map from my drawer. It was prepared, and I said, okay, look at the map. No connection between Gaza Strip and the West Bank. You know that the Palestinian state did not exist before 67? So if you want us to go back to 67, it doesn't create a Palestinian state. I said, okay. I said, okay, so let's start now the discussion. It's not about going back to 67. It's a new creation. It is more problematic than that. And what we tried, and we left Gaza Strip, and we got Hamas in return. Hamas doesn't represent the Palestinian interest. It represents something completely different. So we can have this discussion. I'm not afraid of having discussion on both sides, as long as it is based on the realities on the ground and understanding of the reasons why and the ideology that exists in both sides.
So just for the sake of time, I think we're only going to have time for one more public question, but during the reception there'll be a chance where you can ask, wait, before you guys look so disappointed, let's do this. This might be worse, but here's my idea, is if all three of you can ask a question, and then we'll ask the minister just to pick one, not her favorite, just a question to answer, and that way all of the questions will kind of make it into public, and then the discussion can continue at the reception after. Fair? I've been standing here for 20 minutes. Okay. Well, we'll do the best we can, so thank you guys.
Hi, thank you for coming. Do you worry that sometimes it can legitimize violence against Palestinians within the Palestinian state? Sorry. When we often discuss two states as if the end goal is to have two separate states, or when we discuss nation states in general, the idea of people having a state that represents them is the end goal and good. Do you worry that sometimes it justifies violence against Palestinians by their own governments or representatives when we discuss with them, or when we negotiate with, say, Abu Mazen, who hasn't been elected in 14 years and is 10 years over his...
Hi, well, first I want to thank you so much for coming. My name is Felix, in case it matters. I'm a reporter for the Daily Pennsylvanian, just in case that matters. But I want to ask that after your illustrious 20-year career in politics, what was your biggest, what are you most proud of, what's your biggest regret, and what do you plan on doing now after you've retired?
Thank you for coming. This is kind of off topic, but I think relative because I haven't heard anyone speak of it. But by 2050, majority of the Israeli population is going to be Hasidic. Do you think that's going to affect Israelis, like Israel as a whole? Haredi.
Okay, thanks. As we said, I'm a lawyer by profession, and this is regarding the question about Abu Mazen. I continue saying it's not about establishing a Palestinian state, it's about ending the conflict. Abu Mazen has the permission, but in a way, I'm willing to sign an agreement with somebody who has signature rights on an empty bank account. Abu Mazen cannot deliver in Gaza. He was not elected. I truly don't care. He is the chairperson of the PLO, and is entitled to sign on behalf of the Palestinian on an agreement. The agreement would not be implemented the next day, and the Hamas would be against it. I truly don't care, because I don't know what's coming next. who's coming next. And maybe this is the last moment in which we can sign an agreement, and frankly now it doesn't seem that Abu Mazen wants to sign an agreement. But I wanted to sign an agreement with them. And I truly don't care about the Palestinian democracy or not. It's not about them, it's about us. And in the moment in which we reach a signature, this is a moment in which we got Security Council resolution. This is a moment in which it would be understood what are the borders of the State of Israel, that on the other side we are going to have a demilitarized state. All the parameters would be clear, and then we'll see what's going on. I mean, Israel is strong enough to handle its complicated situation. We are facing it in Lebanon, we are facing it in Syria, we are facing it elsewhere. The problem is now that we don't have even borders, and as long as we didn't make the decision and we didn't end the conflict, everything is open. And talking about achievements, for example, I achieved from the Palestinians the understanding and the acceptance that the Palestinian state would be demilitarized. It was part of the negotiations. They were not willing to say so. So I asked, why not? They said, because it's about dignity and sovereignty. I said, fine. Okay. So the first article of the agreement would be that we are creating and establishing a Palestinian sovereign state. The second article would be that this sovereign state decides that it is demilitarized, like Germany after the Second World War, like Japan. And then I said, you know that without the second article, you are not going to get the first article. So they accepted it. Another thing is I convinced President Bush to give Israel a letter saying that the answer to the refugee problem is the creation of a Palestinian state in accordance. Exactly what I did here with you. 2 states for 2 peoples means that each state gives an answer to national aspirations of different people. I was Minister of Immigrant Absorption those days, so I said, okay, the moment in which on the Palestinian side we would have Minister of Immigrant Absorption, this would be really the end of conflict. And President Bush gave Israel a letter saying this. And what was the third question? About the Haredim. I paid the price. I mean, I got a mandate to form a government, but because of the Haredim, I didn't become the prime minister. I believe that it is also, I know that it sounds maybe exaggerating, but it is also connected to the fact that we didn't solve the conflict. And I tell you why, because the division in Israel is that you have right-wing plus Haredim. And in order to keep right-wing, those that don't want to solve the conflict in accordance with the idea of those poor peoples, they are paying the Haredim whatever they want. And after reaching the point in which this is not part of the agenda, secular Israelis, both sides of the aisle, can decide that they are not paying everything to, or not giving the monopoly of the Jewishness of the state of the Haredim. And let's start having education in Israel based on common denominator. We are having different streams, different schools in which you speak in Hebrew, schools in which you speak in Arabic, and schools in which you speak in Yiddish. And in part you teach mathematics and English, and in others you are not. It's crazy. This is really talking about different tribes living in the same state, in the same country. And I believe that this is all something that we need. I'm not worried about what would happen in the future, I'm worried about the situation now. And I believe that it is all connected, that everything is being influenced from the fact that we have this huge question mark, what would happen in this tiny place, and what's going to be the future of the state of Israel in connected. It's not about security, it's about the values of the state of Israel. And the last question, what am I going to do next? Who knows? I'm going to live. hopefully contribute with my beliefs to Israel, to the world, I don't know. But usually I make my decision in a moment in which I need to make the decision. I didn't plan my life in a strategic manner. I decided to join politics in one day, I share this with you, in Yom Kippur, after having, thinking what I'm going to leave to my children. I was a lawyer by profession. I said, okay, that's nice. I can leave them quite nice bank account, but I prefer to leave them a secure Jewish democratic state. I did my best. I reached a point in which I understood that I cannot continue. I didn't want to throw votes that can be part of what we call camp of center left in Israel. But I will contribute as far as I can. Thank you.
Before we give you some gifts and say thank you again, I want to underscore, if you happen to be at all three of the speakers' events this year, Michael Solomonoff, Ambassador Dermer, and Minister Livni, there is one common denominator that all three speakers said, which is that you can't plan out your life. That when they were in college, or when they were 18 to 22, they never could predict it, that they would end up in the positions they're in. And so I think that's also maybe off topic, but it's a life topic that I think is relevant for our own wellness and mental health at Penn. So thank you. I want to invite up Bonnie Mendelson to give you some last two gifts.
On behalf of Penn Hill, we just wanted to thank you so much for speaking with us this evening. Thank you everyone for joining us.
Let's do it. So copyright infringement. Yeah, sushi and wine outside. Thank you, everyone.